Hello, everybody. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about environmental physiology. In particular, we want to apply various environmental conditions to exercise and kind of understand how these environmental stressors are going to affect our exercise capacity and our exercise performance. So the first topic we are going to focus on is heat. And when we think about thermal regulation or our ability to balance our body temperatures, it's important for us to understand that there are several different checks and balances available in order for us to maintain temperature. And temperature is going to be maintained within a very narrow range. So we have a homeostatic set point, and we've got, like I said, lots of checks and balances in place that are going to allow us to maintain body temperature within this kind of narrow range. Okay, so to kind of kick us off, we have 6 factors that would allow us to gain heat. So the factors that would allow us to gain heat in the right circumstances include radiation, conduction, convection, resting metabolic rate, muscle activity or physical activity, and then the thermic effect of food. Okay, so each of those factors will allow us to produce or gain heat within the body and therefore allow us to elevate body temperature. Okay. There are 4 factors that are going to allow us to lose heat. Radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation are the 4 factors that allow us to lose heat. Now notice that 3 of the 4 heat loss factors can also serve as heat gains. Okay, and so we'll talk about temperature and how it's going to flow down a gradient in order for homeostasis to be maintained or established, right? So again, it's all about establishing a gradient in the appropriate way, and based on that gradient, that will determine whether or not radiation is giving us heat or causing us to lose heat. Same thing with conduction and convection. Either can serve as a heat gain or a heat loss, depending on the situation, and we'll talk more about that here coming up. So as I mentioned, thermal balance is really important for us to maintain, and we are monitoring our core very, very closely within this small temperature range of 36.5 to 37.5 degrees Celsius. And the core represents our deep central tissues. Okay. And the shell of the body represents the body's periphery. So think like the skin and kind of that external portion of the body. Okay. And our shell is going to be much more variant in temperature. And the reason for that is it's going to allow us to regulate heat transfer from the core to the environment or vice versa. Okay, so again, the shell is going to serve as kind of a buffer in order for us to maintain temperature at that core level. So when we think about this balance of temperature, our circulatory system or our blood flow is going to allow us to fine-tune temperature regulation through the shunting of blood. Okay, so we can kind of decide where we send blood throughout the body, and blood serves as an excellent medium for us to carry heat. And so therefore we can kind of manipulate where we send that blood in order for us to therefore manipulate body temperature. Okay, so again, if we are in a cold environment, let's say we're outside at a football game, whatever, and it's a little chilly, it's late fall, we're going to experience blood shunting. And so the idea there is we're going to have constriction or shrinking up of those vessels, so that we have less blood flow sent to the skin surface. And that's going to allow us to maintain the blood and the heat at the core. Okay. Again, if we experience blood shunting in a cold environment, we're very likely to experience like cold nose, cold ears, cold fingers, because again, we're decreasing circulation to those areas in order for us to preserve the heat at the core. And again, our body's willing to kind of prioritize your core above your fingers and your nose and your like ears, because we need to maintain the temperature of those vital organs. So therefore we're willing to sacrifice temperature, like I said, in some of those extremities in order for us to protect those vital organs that are kind of internal. Okay. If we're in a hot environment, we can experience vasodilation, and this will allow us to send more heat to the skin surface so that it can be dissipated into the ambient environment or the environment around us. Okay. And again, the movement of blood or the constriction or vasodilation of these blood vessels allows us to manipulate the size of the shell. Okay, so we can increase the increase the shell size if we experience vasoconstriction, and we can decrease the shell size, that's hard to say, with vasodilation. So where does all of this information become regulated? So we are going to have the hypothalamus as kind of our thermostat within the body. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to allow us to contain that central coordinating center for temperature regulation, also known as the thermostat within the body. And again, the idea here is we want to carefully keep that temperature around 37 degrees. And there are two ways for us to activate body heat regulating mechanisms. Number one were those vascular adjustments that we just mentioned, so we can experience vasoconstriction or vasodilation. And the other factor would be to allow us to experience evaporation. So in a hot environment, I want to start sweating more. And the reason that sweat serves as a great way for us to dissipate heat is because those water molecules are going to dissipate from their liquid form into a gaseous molecule, and that allows us to transfer the heat from that liquid into the air around us. So as we said, when we are in the heat, the body has four processes that are going to allow us to lose heat. Number one, radiation. Number two, conduction. Number three, convection. And number four, evaporation. In no particular order, we're going to talk about all four of them. But again, those are kind of those four principles that allow us to lose heat. Okay, so let's start with radiation. And we think about how radiation works. Essentially, radiation involves us having these electromagnetic heat waves or radiant energy. Okay, so basically we have like these electromagnetic rays shooting off of us in every direction. And it produces what's called radiant energy. And in order for us to lose heat in this way, we don't have to have a physical connection to something around us. Okay, so for example, when I was in college, I worked in a restaurant. And you would show up at 4 o'clock or whatever, you'd work your shift, and it'd get really hot in the room while you're working. And again, the reason for that is we have all these people come in and sit in close proximity, and the radiation from each individual radiates against the walls, the floor, any surface that is around them. Okay, when those people leave, then the temperature in that room immediately decreases, right? So again, we can experience changes in temperature based on these radiation or these electromagnetic heat waves that people are producing that are around us. Okay, this is also the way that we gain heat from the sun. So the sun is producing these electromagnetic rays as well. And so if it's sunny out, even if it's a cold temperature, it's going to feel warmer because we're gaining heat through these electromagnetic heat waves that are coming from the sun, even when it's cold. So that's kind of cool. So radiation is going to account for about 67% of our heat loss when we're at rest. So again, we're just kind of walking around, shooting steam off of us, you could think of it that way, through these electromagnetic waves. Okay, conduction involves direct heat transfer from one molecule to another liquid, solid, or gas. Okay, so when we think about conduction, this involves warming air molecules or water molecules that come in contact with the skin's surface. Okay, so the rate of conductive heat loss depends on two factors. Number one, the temperature gradient. Okay, so the greater the temp difference, the more conduction that can occur. Okay. And number two, the thermal qualities of the surface will make a difference. Okay. So again, the idea with this is it has to be direct transfer. Okay. So when we think about, I mentioned going to a football game. So let's go with that example again. So imagine that we're going to go to a football game. It's November, it's cold outside, and we go sit on that cold bleacher. Right. So when your butt hits that cold bleacher, that bleacher is 50 degrees or whatever, and your butt is a lot warmer than that. Okay. Through conduction, because we're physically connected to that bleacher seat, okay, we're going to transfer heat in either directions. Okay. So now your butt's going to feel cold and the bench is going to feel warm when you stand up. Okay, so again, that's an example of conduction. We have that direct transfer of heat from the person to the bench or to the seat. Okay. Another example, let's say it is cold. It's November right now as I'm recording this. So we'll continue with that example. We talked about the thermal quality of the surface making a big difference in the rate of conductive heat loss. So For example, like in the summer, it's nice to have like a light cotton or like a silk sheet. And the reason for that is it doesn't have a lot of thermal quality, right? So if it's hot out, that's a nice, comfortable material for us to have on because it's not going to keep the heat in as much as let's say like a flannel sheet or something along those lines. The flannel has this great thermal quality that's going to allow us to maintain heat within that surface. Okay, so again, if you're like me and you're very routine in nature, when I wake up, I throw the sheets back. My husband's already always awake. And I go to the bathroom, I brush my teeth, I go get my cup of coffee. I might do a few other things. And then about 15 minutes later or so, I come back to make the bed. And in the bed, it's still warm, right? And the reason that it's warm is because the body heat from conduction, from me laying in that bed is still warm based on the thermal qualities of the sheets, of the comforter, whatever's in your bed. So a couple examples there relating to conduction. When we think about convection, I always think convection oven, which that like helps me. Maybe that's helpful for you, maybe not if you're not interested in baking. But convection has to do with movement. Okay, so this is going to be heat loss via the movement of a gas or a liquid across the skin surface. Okay, so again, you can think about this as air or water. Okay, and a couple of different examples here. So the air around our skin acts as a zone of insulation and will minimize further heat loss. But if that air is constantly being replaced, such as when it's windy, convection usually replaces that zone of insulation. Okay, so again, this is why we use like the term wind chill or feels like temperature when it's cold, right? If it's 40 degrees out but feels like 10 degrees, that means it's probably pretty windy and we're going to lose a lot of heat through convection because we're constantly replacing that air that's right next to the skin surface, right? This is also true when we're in the water as well. So if we're standing in cold water, that's not as tolling for us as swirling cold water. Okay, swirling cold water is very, very tolling for us in terms of heat loss because it removes that insulatory zone of the water that's right next to the skin surface. Okay, so we think about evaporation. Again, this is the only medium that serves as a heat loss, but not a heat gain potential. Okay, so we can only lose heat through evaporation. But water vaporizes from the respiratory passageways and the skin surface to transfer heat to the environment. And we're going to use what are called eccrine sweat glands, and these are controlled by the cholinergic sympathetic nerve fibers. And essentially, we are going to lose about 300 mils of water per day via respiration. So again, if you are familiar with wrestling, when athletes are getting close to needing to weigh in, they'll use a term called drifting. And so if I go to bed at night and I weigh 140 pounds, when I wake up in the morning, I'll probably weigh 137, 138, something along those lines. And the reason for that is this water loss via respiration. So while you breathe, when you sleep, you're losing that fluid. So you're a little bit more dehydrated when you wake up in comparison to when you went to bed. So that's a big contributor there to what wrestlers call drifting in the night. This insensible perspiration will also play an important role in water loss and heat loss. Okay, insensible perspiration is like sweating when you don't even know you're sweating. So like we'll put water on the skin surface and it's accepted into the ambient environment fairly readily without us really even knowing that it's there. And what's interesting is your body will adapt its insensible perspiration based on our environmental conditions, right? So again, if it's really dry in the air, so for example, like in the winter, it's very dry in the air, there's not a lot of humidity or not a lot of moisture, that means that the air is more likely to accept these water molecules off of your skin surface because the air isn't saturated with water molecules, which is why it's more common for us to get dry skin in the winter because those water molecules that sit on our skin surface are more easily accepted into the ambient air. Okay, same thing is true, like chapped lips would be really common in a cold, dry environment, or if we, just went to a cold, dry environment, because more of the water molecules are being accepted. So we're losing some of that moisture that would otherwise keep us kind of not chapped, I guess. And then, the reverse is true in a humid environment. So if it's humid, we don't have dry skin. We're more likely to experience maybe breakouts on our face because that water is going to kind of sit there and not be easily accepted. So that can cause clogged pores and kind of some other issues. But again, it would be less common for us to experience dry skin if the environment is humid. And again, it all has to do with evaporation and evaporative processes. Okay. So again, what I think one thing that's really important to note here is that evaporation is the most important dissipator of heat in a hot environment and during exercise. Okay, so at rest, it's accounting for about 23% of heat dissipation. And again, when we're at rest, we're not really in a threatening thermoregulatory position. So it makes sense that evaporation will play a minimal role for us. However, as we add the stressor of either a hot environment or exercise, our need for evaporation becomes more important. Okay. As ambient temperature, so the temperature around you, exceeds our shell temperature, evaporation serves as the only mechanism available for heat dissipation, as conduction and convection and radiation will serve as heat gains. So evaporation is really our only option here for heat loss. So when we think about evaporation and heat loss through our sweat, it's affected by four factors. Number one, humidity. Number two, electrolyte concentration. Number three, air temp. And number four, clothing. Okay, so we think about humidity. Again, the more humid the environment, the more difficult it is for us to evaporate because that air is already saturated with water molecules. So it's a little more challenging for us to have those water molecules be accepted when the air is already kind of dense with water. Number two, electrolyte concentration. So the more concentrated our sweat is, the more challenging it is for it to be dissipated in the form of gas. Okay, so again, ideally, when we are in a hot environment, we would prefer our sweat be low in electrolytes. We want to retain those electrolytes. And again, that's going to increase the likelihood that those molecules be accepted into the air. Okay. Air temp, again, that will play an important role with evaporation, and then clothing, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the cold section of this lecture. So how do we integrate heat dissipation mechanisms? Okay, so we talked about circulation. We also talked about evaporation. So circulation, in a hot environment, blood vessels vasodilate to divert warm blood from the core to the shell, and that's going to allow us to dissipate heat. Now, unfortunately, what happens when we exercise is we're going to have to split up our blood a little bit, right? We only have a certain amount of blood available. So 15 to 25% of our cardiac output is going to go to the skin surface, and this will allow us to enhance heat loss through conduction. However, that takes blood away from the muscle where we're trying to do some sort of work. So that can be problematic for us in that regard. Okay. Evaporation, so sweating reaches equilibrium about 30 minutes into exercise. So again, that just means that we're going to have a consistent kind of regular rate of water loss or sweat loss, you could say, once we kind of hit that 30-minute mark. Again, that's probably a good indication for us that in order for us to really be like warmed up when we're getting ready to compete, it's probably got to be, 20 good minutes of us doing things before we're kind of really at that equilibrium. Okay, it will rely on a combination of increased circulation and evaporation for us to have effective heat dissipation. Okay, so we think about circulatory responses. I just thought this was kind of cool. It kind of shows you the difference between humans and dogs in terms of how this all goes together. So here you can see our circulatory responses when it's cold. Again, we are going to vasoconstrict our vessels and pull that blood to the core and allow us to maintain core temp. Okay. In a hot environment, we're going to experience vasodilation, and that means we are going to open up those vessels. We are going to send blood to the skin or to the shell of the individual. And as that blood enters the shell or the skin surface, that's going to allow us to experience conduction and convection to the greatest extent. Okay, what's interesting with animals is they're going to lose their heat through respiration. So again, I'm sure you've seen dogs panting before. The reason that they're panting isn't because they're out of breath. They're trying to get rid of their heat in that way. So we have a couple different hormones that are going to play an important role in terms of adjusting based on what's going on as it relates to sweat and heat and exercise. Okay, so sweat causes water and electrolyte loss, and this becomes a huge concern for us if we're doing prolonged exercise or in a hot environment. Okay, so again, what we will do is we'll increase the release of two hormones. We'll release aldosterone and we'll release ADH. Aldosterone's job is to help us retain sodium. So it's going to increase sodium retention or allow us to kind of like hold on to the sodium so that we're not like losing it or excreting it. And the reason for that is sodium is kind of like a leader within the body. And if I hold on to sodium, water is kind of like a follower. So water wants to follow sodium. So if I hold on to the sodium, that increases the likelihood that I'll also hold on to the water. Okay. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. And the way I always remember this is a diuretic is something that makes you pee. So an antidiuretic is something that makes you not pee. And that's exactly what ADH does. It helps us to retain water. So it's going to reduce our urine production. And again, the idea with that is that we don't need to be getting rid of water through urine when we're in a hot environment. We want to hold on to that water so that we can use it as sweat if we need to modify our temperature. So when we think about exercise in the heat, again, we'll experience circulatory adjustments. Like I said, we want to send some blood to the skin surface. However, we also have to send blood to our muscles. Okay, so we're going to have competition for blood flow. We're going to send some to the muscles, but we're also going to send some to the skin surface. So how does that affect our cardiac output? It will actually cause a decrease in cardiac output because we have that blood out everywhere. And again, that becomes pretty problematic for us as we are, trying to do exercise in the heat. Interestingly, I think that people have a wide range of abilities to tolerate heat. And as a cross country and track coach, again, I've seen many issues kind of firsthand at different meets and competitions and things like that as it relates to heat tolerance. Okay. And again, we can have heat related illness. We can have heat issues when it's 65. Like it is crazy to see these types of issues kind of creep in, particularly for our younger athletes. If we're working with, high school athletes, like this can be a huge issue. But we think about individuals' ability to tolerate heat. There are 5 factors that we should consider. Number one is acclimatization. Okay, so again, you can think about this based on our seasons that we're working with, right? So it's much more common for us to see issues with heat in May. So if we get a random hot day, for example, like at the state track meet in May, we'll see a lot more athletes struggle with that in comparison to maybe September. If it's hot in September, well, all those athletes have had, all summer to kind of acclimatize to that. So acclimatization to heat can certainly be seasonal, particularly if you live in the Midwest and we have these different seasons. So that is certainly something to keep in mind. Number two, training status. So again, highly trained individuals generally tend to do better in a heat or in a heat stressor. And again, what are the reasons for that? Number one, maybe they're accustomed to training at or being in those conditions. Number two, they have a greater fluid volume within their bodies as they're, higher trained athletes. So those factors make a difference. Age is a huge factor for heat tolerance. So again, like I said, kids and older adults are going to struggle in a hot environment. Gender, we believe that there could be some gender differences in terms of heat tolerance, and then body fat percentage as well. So what about heat acclimatization? So again, I said that, this can certainly be seasonal if we're looking at individuals that live in the Midwest. And how does this happen? We can have heat acclimatization as early as within 10 days of heat exposure. And what happens when you become more acclimatized to the heat? You'll experience an earlier onset of sweating. And again, the reason for that is your body kind of recognizes that you're going to be under a thermal stressor. And so it kind of kicks the engine a little bit faster in order for us to get that process kind of rolling within homeostasis. Our sweat is more hypotonic. So again, we talked about electrolytes and how we don't want to put a lot of electrolytes into our sweat because that reduces their ability to like be accepted into the air around them. So if our sweat's hypotonic, that means that there's not a lot of electrolytes in there. It's mostly water. And again, that would be an advantage for us with heat acclimation. And then this is kind of cool, more effective sweat placement. So again, generally speaking, men tend to be like wasteful sweaters. So again, they're gonna sweat a lot in certain areas, and then that sweat's just gonna drip off of their skin, and that's not effective for us. If that water molecule doesn't get accepted into the air around us, then it did nothing but dehydrate us. Okay, so we can have more effective sweat placement. And what's cool about this is like if you are in a t-shirt, your body knows that. And so it'll focus putting that sweat on like the lower arm. If you had like a razorback tank top on or whatever, okay, now you have your shoulder blades kind of opened. And so now your body knows to kind of place sweat in those areas. So we can place our sweat pretty darn effectively as we become more acclimatized. And I think that's so cool to think that your body can tell the difference between what clothing you're wearing and kind of where to place that sweat. And then lastly, we'll experience lower skin and core temperatures with regular heat acclimation. Okay, how much do I need to do? Again, you need to do a minimum of 10 days of exercise, but we're looking at this. This seems a little bit wild, or maybe not applicable so much, but 100 minutes of exercise per day is the appropriate maximal stimuli for eliciting acclimatization. So we need to be at the temperature and exercise intensity at which you'd like to compete in order for us to gain the acclimatization that's appropriate based on, you know, when and what you want to compete at when you are going to have a competition in a hot environment. However, as you're preparing for a competition, you probably don't want to do 100 minutes per day at the exercise intensity at which you want to compete. So it would be appropriate to kind of spread this out a little bit further. So instead of just 10 days, let's stretch it and have it more like 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks of kind of monitored, purposeful heat training can be an effective method for individuals that are looking to compete in a hot environment. So then we know that age will have an effect on our ability to cope with heat as well. So we will experience a decreased heat dissipation capacity around the age of 50. Again, there can be some variance there. We also know that children are less effective at thermal regulation, and the reason for that is they don't have as well developed sweat glands yet. So kids are kind of lacking in that area. When we think about our older adults, they're going to have modified sensitivity to their thermal receptors, which are going to detect information about body temperature and temperature around them as well. They also have impacts on their sweat glands in terms of their output ability, and then smaller vasomotor tone. So when we think about our ability to shunt blood to various locations, they're going to be a little bit limited in that capacity as well. So when we think about gender and we think about males versus females, interestingly, thermal regulation was one of the, I guess, initial reasons that it was thought that women were like weaker than men. And the reason for that is essentially people believed that women had a lesser tolerance for heat, but it's actually shown now that women can tolerate heat maybe better than men. And the reason for that has to do with the mechanism through which each of us are going to dissipate heat. So men are more likely to utilize sweating. So men are going to more likely be wasteful sweaters. So in a hot environment, they might sweat too much, and so therefore produce wasteful sweat, and so have a greater risk of dehydration because of that. Women are going to maybe focus more on shunting blood to the skin surface. So they're going to utilize the processes of convection and conduction in order to dissipate heat as opposed to sweating. So they're going to have a heightened heart rate response to hot environments in comparison to men. So at the end of the day, it turns out that we can achieve the same level of acclimatization. It's believed potentially that women have a slight advantage though, in a general sense in a hot environment, but I would say for the most part, again, if you're working with both men and women, we probably are going to be pretty equal in our capacity to cope with heat. Training status will probably be more important to consider for each of our athletes as opposed to gender. Okay, so that's a little bit about the heat. Now we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about cold environments. So when we think about cold environments and how these can be stressful for us, it's important for us to kind of understand from a physiological perspective, most of the mechanisms that we have are going to protect us from overheating. And so when we think about cold environments, really it's all about our ability to behaviorally modify what we're doing, where we're at, and that type of thing. So while many changes could be made to exercise in heat, most of the changes that we make in the cold will probably be behavioral in nature, right? So again, we have a much higher tolerance physiologically for heat in comparison to cold environments. So what is a cold stressor? A cold stressor is any condition or environment that causes a loss of body heat and threatens homeostasis. And we have two major types of cold stressors. It could be cold air or cold water. Now, one thing that is important to note when we talk about cold stress, in that environmental condition that's going to cause body heat loss, it's important that we note that sometimes it doesn't matter what the ambient temperature is, right? It has maybe more to do with the clothing that we're wearing in that ambient temperature, right? So again, if I have really good thermal many layers, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit, but really good winter gear for exercising in, I can probably be comfortable in a lot of different cold temperatures. 20 degrees is no problem, right? Versus if I'm out there and I don't have the right clothing or my clothing becomes wet, those conditions are not equivalent, right? So again, a lot of this has to do not so much with the environmental temperature, but the skin temperature, or what we call our shell temperature. And we'll talk about that microenvironment that's going to sit on top of our skin surface and how important that is to our ability to kind of regulate what's happening from a thermoregulatory perspective in a cold environment. So what are the mechanisms that we can use physiologically to avoid excessive heat loss? Number one, peripheral vasoconstriction. So blood vessels are going to vasoconstrict to the periphery, causing smooth muscle contraction around the blood vessels. So again, the idea here, we know that blood is an excellent medium for us to transport heat. So we want to keep that heat close to our core. Okay, so in a cold environment, we are willing to kind of sacrifice our peripheral extremities in order for us to keep that heat at our core. So that is number one. Number two, we can experience something known as non-shivering thermogenesis. And thermo means heat, genesis means to create. So we're creating heat in a non-shivering mechanism. And essentially what happens with this is we're going to experience an increase in metabolic rate, but we're not actually doing any useful work, right? So again, we're going to activate the nervous system in order for us to burn calories, because when we burn calories, we will liberate heat during that process. That's why we get hot. That's why we sweat when we exercise, because our body temperature is increasing. And so with this thermogenesis process, we're not necessarily creating any useful work. We're just creating heat that we can then liberate to help keep us warm. Shivering is number three, and shivering is involuntary contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscles. And this is usually in an antagonistic form, right? So again, I'm going to have the contraction and relaxation of two muscles that do the opposite things. And that's going to allow me to not have movement, but have muscle contraction enough to produce heat because we're burning through those calories. Okay, these three processes together can allow us to have a 4 to 5-fold increase in body heat production when we are in a cold environment. Another important thing to note when we think about the effects of a cold environment are our insulation. Okay, so the shell represents our physiological insulation based on number one, vasoconstriction of the vessels in the periphery, and number two, subcutaneous fat. So again, understanding that our shell can be modified based on the conditions at any point during any given day, honestly. So again, we can modify that blood flow. Certainly the subcutaneous fat we could change over time. That wouldn't be something that we would change like pretty regularly, but could gradually change over time. So we know that insulation will act as a barrier between our heat source, which is our core, and the ambient environment or the environment that we're surrounded by. Okay. So what are some factors that are going to affect the rate of heat loss? Number one will be the clothing, and we'll talk more about that here coming up. Number two, body size and body composition, wind chill, and then the surrounding medium. Being in water versus in air will make a huge difference in terms of that conduction of heat. So when we think about the effects of clothing on thermoregulation, we know that clothing will insulate the body, which slows the loss of heat via conduction and convection in a cold environment. And this is kind of interesting. I don't know if I'm the only person that still thinks that this is kind of cool, but when they first started doing environmental research, which was quite a while ago, they used the term CLO unit to create what's known as an index of thermal resistance. And this tells us the insulatory properties of a clothing item. So 1 CLO unit is the amount of clothing needed to maintain a sedentary person in an environment of about 70 degrees with 50% relative humidity. And the thing that I think is cute about this is 1 CLO unit is equal to 1 lightweight business suit. And the reason that that's kind of the standard is it was like the 1940s when they started this research, and that was like the normal attire for males at that time. So 1 CLO unit is equal to 1 lightweight business suit. And again, the higher the CLO unit, the more insulation the clothing has. The lower the CLO unit, the lower the insulatory properties. Okay. So there are 4 different factors that will determine the CLO value of clothing. Number 1 is wind speed. So again, the faster the wind speed, the lower the CLO unit. Okay. Number 2 is something known as the chimney effect. So if we have loosely hanging clothing, it doesn't trap the air as effectively. And the best thing that we can do in a cold environment is create a really sound microenvironment against our skin surface. So basically we want to trap air against our skin surface so that that air is like warmer in comparison to the ambient air. So it just creates like a gradient for air temperature. And so if the clothing is loose, then it can't effectively trap that air in that layer. And so therefore with movement of the air, that air can't stay as warm, basically. We also have the bellows effect, which if we have vigorous body movements, this will increase ventilation of those air layers. So for example, if you're riding your bike, right, and those clothing items are going to have an impact, a less of an impact, I should say, because of the movement of your body through the air, right? So vigorous body movements will increase ventilation of those air layers. And then lastly is the permeation efficiency factor of the clothing. So this is number 4, and this is how well clothing absorbs sweat and wicks it away from the body's surface. So again, think like your dry fit materials versus cotton t-shirts, right? So that dry fit material is able to pull that sweat away from the body's surface and keep your shirt drier, while also potentially like dissipating heat through the sweat. But most importantly, it keeps that surface dry, because once the shirt or the clothing becomes wet, it loses its insulatory properties. So here you can kind of see, this is just an example that I think is kind of cool. This shows you the CLO unit values of a couple of different items here. So again, you can see like a short sleeve shirt, underwear, shorts, socks and shoes has a CLO value of 0.38. And then here you can see like a sweater and a long sleeve shirt, long pants, etc. So again, just thought this was kind of interesting to be able to compare and contrast CLO values for various items. Okay. So we think about cold weather clothing. Again, the most important thing that we can do is create a microenvironment that's warmer than the ambient environment. This temperature, again, will kind of be on a gradient. So it'll be colder than our shell or like the skin temp, but warmer than the ambient temperature. And so if we use like fur or feathers or several light layers, this is kind of the best case scenario for us to allow us to trap air within these particular locations in order for us to create this gradient so that the layer that's closest to our skin surface is very warm, and so therefore we feel warm. Right? So the mesh of the cloth fibers is going to trap this air between the clothing and the skin surface, forming a microenvironment. So the thicker that layer of trapped air, the more effective that clothing has served as insulation. Okay, so again, we do know that several light layers is going to be better than a single bulky layer. Also feathers, so like a down jacket or fur of some sort, like fur lined items are great because it allows us to kind of trap that air and allows us to therefore retain the heat. Other things that are important with cold weather, so wearing a hat contributes significantly to heat conservation. So you maybe have probably heard this before, but 30 to 40% of the heat is lost through the head. When our clothing does become wet, it loses about 90% of its insulating properties, which is why it's really important when we are in a cold environment and we're going to be exercising, that base layer should be kind of that dry fit or that sweat wicking material, so that if you do sweat, we don't want that shirt or that base layer to get wet, because once it becomes wet, it loses 90% of its insulatory properties. So again, the issue there, we know that water conducts heat about 25 times faster than air. So we do know that cold water is going to be significantly more dangerous to us in comparison to cold air. So again, we think about ideal winter garments for cold, dry weather. We want them to block air movement but allow water vapor from sweat to escape through the clothing. Individuals, so again, here thinking about body fat percentage, so individuals with more subcutaneous fat have increased effectiveness for maintaining core temperature. So we know that skin fold measurements, or like the amount of fat that's stored under the skin surface, would be a good indication of somebody's tolerance for cold exposure. However, the physiological stress from a cold environment will greatly depend on a couple factors. Number one, the person's metabolic rate. So you could be thin or not have a lot of body fat, but have a high metabolic rate, and so therefore you're producing enough heat that lack of body fat percentage doesn't really affect you, or kind of balances out, you could say. And then number two, the other factor is the body's resistance to heat flow. So this would be directly related to subcutaneous fat. So the fat that serves as an insulator and is resistant to heat movement. So we think about body size and body composition. Again, subcutaneous fat and peripheral muscle mass are both excellent insulators. So again, those are kind of two opposite things, but both will allow us to maintain our core temp. The other thing that's kind of interesting when we think about body size is this concept of body surface area to body mass ratio. And essentially, individuals with a large surface area have greater heat loss. So what I'm saying, this is a weird way to explain it, but this is like the only way that makes sense to me. If you were to like cut your skin off and lay it on the ground, that tells us your total surface area. Okay, so again, people that have a large surface area are going to be like tall, lanky people, right? As opposed to like short, compact people. They're not going to have as large of a surface area in comparison to body mass ratio. So individuals that have this large surface area are generally going to be like tall, lanky people, right? They have a lot of skin that's exposed, but not a lot of muscle or fat to kind of keep themselves warm, right? So the best people in this environment are going to be those shorter, stockier people. They're going to have a lower body surface area to body mass ratio. So we think about gender differences. Again, we talked a little bit about this in the heat, but we know that women tend to have more body fat in comparison to men, but we think that gender differences in cold environment are pretty minimal. Women might have more body fat, but men maybe have a little bit more muscle mass to create, a higher metabolic rate. So that maybe those two things balance out. We do know that as people age, they tend to become less tolerant to these cold environments. Okay. We mentioned this previously, and again, when we think about conduction and convection, wind chill is really important to consider if we're exercising, competing, or immersed in a cold environment. So wind chill, we cannot necessarily understand the severity of a cold environment just based on the ambient temperature. It's also important that we understand that wind chill factor. So air currents on a windy day will magnify heat loss because those warmer insulatory layers surrounding the body will continue to exchange with cooler ambient air. Okay, so we'll see increased wind that causes heat loss via conduction and convection. So this is just to kind of show you that kind of relationship. So as that wind speed picks up, you can see how that air temperature or that wind chill will decrease. So as I mentioned, we think about heat loss in cold water. We know that the thermal conductivity of water is 26 times greater than air. So again, when we think about being in cold water, this is significantly more challenging for individuals in comparison to cold air. So the body will generally lose heat 4 times faster in water than it does of air of that same temperature. So we know that death from hypothermia can occur when water temp is well above freezing. Heat loss in water is further accelerated if that water is swirling around because of that convection property. Okay. And victims can become weak, lose consciousness within minutes of being submerged in cold water. And again, it doesn't even have to be that cold. It could be 50s, and we can have people becoming unconscious within minutes in that particular type of environment versus like we can comfortably survive in 50-degree air temperature for forever, probably. So again, really, really interesting to look at the differences in those types of threats. So again, when we think about hypothermia, if that water is 35 degrees, you'll have loss of dexterity within less than 2 minutes. Exhaustion or unconsciousness can occur in less than 15 minutes, and your expected time of survival is only 15 to 45 minutes. So what happens in a cold environment, once that core temp falls below 34.5 degrees, the hypothalamus loses its ability to kind of regulate the body temp. And so basically what happens then is we decrease our metabolic rate by about 50%, and you can fall into a coma. Sometimes you can come out of it, so it is kind of a protective mechanism to kind of keep the body I guess safe. I don't know if that's what I would describe it as, but that's essentially what happens when we reach that hypothermic state. So again, when we think about our physiological response to a cold environment, we know that there's a neural and hormonal response. The hypothalamus is activated by peripheral skin receptors and blood receptors, and this will stimulate the pituitary. The pituitary is going to release ACTH and also thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone's job is to increase our metabolic rate. Again, higher metabolic rate means more heat production. ACTH is going to increase substrates such as glucose and fats into the blood. So basically it'll take fuels and put them into the blood so that we're ready to use those fuels when that metabolic rate is then increased. What else happens? So the hypothalamus is going to stimulate peripheral vasoconstriction, and we will experience that shivering response that we mentioned, and then we'll also experiencing the thermogenesis through non-shivering mechanisms. So we'll produce this chemical heat without actually doing any type of like active work. So some of the other considerations to kind of keep in mind when we're working with a cold environment, as we mentioned with hot environments, older adults are also going to struggle in a cold environment. So they are going to experience changes in body composition, fat storage, and hormonal functions. We also see kind of the same effects with kids as well. So kids are going to struggle in a cold environment in addition to their struggles with heat. And again, the reason for issues with a cold environment is a large surface area to mass ratio allows children to dissipate heat a lot easier because of this kind of setup, this ratio. So can we acclimatize to the cold? It turns out that there are, as we mentioned, primarily physiological mechanisms that aren't going to be super modified. However, it's going to be related to more the behavioral changes. However, we do have a few examples of where we can experience acclimatization in the cold. So there was this group of women divers in Korea and South Japan known as the AMA, and they have some indication of cold adaptation. So we've had researchers kind of study this particular group of people. Again, is this related to acclimatization? Is it some sort of genetic characteristic that these women have? But essentially, these women are divers, and they are able to tolerate prolonged exposure to cold because they're diving for food in the cold water. And so in the winter, the temperature is about 50 degrees in the water, and they'll do one 15-minute dive per day. And in the summer, they'll do three 45-minute dives per day, and the water temp then is about 77 degrees. As kind of a reference point, an ice bath is between 50 to 59 degrees, and we are supposed to spend 10 to 20 minutes in an ice bath at any given session. So kind of as a reference point, like these women in the winter months are doing a 15-minute full immersion ice bath essentially for their 15-minute daily dive. Now, what do we see with these women? We see that they have a significant difference in terms of their ability to deviate from homeostasis with their core temp, but also their skin temp as well. So we see that they have kind of an altered mechanism to which they can kind of cope with heat. So, as we mentioned, when looking at a cold environment, it is more important for us to consider the microenvironment as opposed to the ambient temperature. So again, as mentioned, the behavioral changes that we make in a cold environment might be the most important elements. So again, this talks a little bit about the AMA that I was just describing, and essentially what we see with them is we see a significant decrease in skin and core temp when they're submerged in the water. We also see that they have a significantly higher metabolic rate. And so, we're thinking that a lot of this might be related to that non-activity thermogenesis and our ability to just kind of generate heat without doing any useful work. I just thought this was interesting to kind of take a look at what their culture is like and what they are kind of wearing. So these are their winter diving outfits. Okay, so it's like a cloth dress essentially, and then they kind of have like a little face mask that they put on as well. So just for a reference point, I do triathlons, and we'll wear these pretty thick wetsuits, and we'll wear wetsuits if the water temperature is 74 degrees or lower. And so again, the wetsuit's job is to provide us with additional layer of insulation, and allows us to create a microenvironment within the wetsuit. So essentially, like, you'll get a layer of water between your skin and the lining of the wetsuit. And the idea is that we want to warm that water. That's the microenvironment. And by warming that water, it allows us to kind of transition from that cold water to kind of what we want to keep our core temp at. But as you can see with these outfits, these women wouldn't have any of that, right? There's no protection here. That microenvironment is going to be constantly turning over with cold water as they move through there, and this type of material isn't going to catch or capture water in a way that it would allow them to kind of adapt based on their clothing. So a little bit more about cold adaptation. Again, we do believe that there is some cold adaptation that we can experience with regular and prolonged cold air exposure. However, an individual can regulate their core temps potentially at a lower level during this cold stress as they become more used to that type of temperature. And we know that an improved physical fitness enhances our thermoregulatory defense against cold stress. So it would allow us basically the more muscle mass I have, the greater my shivering response. And then also the earlier onset of shivering with cold exposure. So again, the body just becomes a little more attuned to, hey, this is a challenge for me from a temperature perspective. Let's go ahead and kickstart the gears in terms of, how do I, modify this, or how do I cope with this situation? Okay. So in summary, we know that as it relates to cold adaptation, shivering can allow us to increase that body temperature. We also have an improved ability to sleep in the cold. So it is actually better for us to sleep in a cold environment. We are supposed to get better quality sleep when sleeping in a cold environment. We see changes in peripheral blood flow distribution to conserve heat in the core and warm the extremities to prevent cold injury. So again, even when we kind of constrict that blood to the core, we'll shoot out blood to those peripheries in order for us to prevent cold related injury. So in order for us to prevent frostbite and any type of like muscular neural damage, if the extremities get too cold, we'll kind of like send bursts of blood into those particular areas in a cold environment to make sure that that kind of stuff doesn't happen. Okay. What about exercise performance in the cold? We know that with cardiovascular endurance, if we have a decrease in core temp, we'll also experience a decrease in VO2 max. This would be an important reason why, if we are competing in a cold environment, really being diligent with our warm-ups are really important. Okay, so if energy must be exerted in order for us to increase heat performance, heat production, this will decrease performance, because essentially we want to minimize the amount of time we spend worrying about temperature and maximize the amount of time we spend worrying about doing the sport thing. Okay, so cooled blood can become more viscous, which increases our myocardial demand and causes just more stress on the heart in order for us to complete that given task. So essentially, what's the takeaway here? VO2 max will decrease if our core temp decreases. From a muscular endurance perspective, muscular endurance can be enhanced with mild cooling and compromised with severe cooling. Okay, so delays fatigue with mild levels. So again, this is one of the premises that's important when we think about using ice baths and ice techniques as a tool in recovery and some of those elements. From a muscular strength and muscular power perspective, we see that these are both negatively impacted by cold weather. We'll see an increase in cellular viscosity, or like the thickness of the gel inside the cells. We'll see slowing of actin and myosin movement during muscle contraction. Again, essentially the enzymes work best when they're heated, which is why a warm up again is very important. So we're going to slow that enzymatic speed in cold environments. Again, really, really important for us, no matter what type of sport. If we're going to be outside, it's really important that we do a very diligent warm up so that the muscles are warm to kind of help to counteract for some of these environmental concerns. And more to come. So again, we'll talk a little bit when we get to our next unit will be about ergogenic aids, but essentially trying to understand how can we use heat, how can we use cold as part of recovery mechanisms. So thinking like ice bath, cold plunge versus sauna, heating pad, hot showers. We can also talk about kind of the oscillation of these two things. So cold or like an ice bath, hot shower, ice bath type of thing. So kind of setting things up that way and understanding how we can manipulate temperature in order for us to kind of maximize recovery. All right, I think that's it for today. Hope you have a great day. And as always, reach out if you have any questions.